did you know? I haven't even started yet. How did you know? Hello. Okay, I guess we're just waiting on Steven, who's waiting on stucco to dry. And Louie's waiting for me, too. I haven't even started yet, and he just knows to be here. He was in another part of the room, and as soon as I, pressed the button to go live, he was, here. I don't know how he knows. How did you do that? I hope Steven... Okay, Steven, I hope you know it takes 2 hours for stucco to dry. He gets the notifications. You have a smartphone I don't know about? I don't remember adding you on Facebook. Okay, well now that Steven's here, well, you can patch and listen. Alright, don't mess with that stuff though, just stay right here. Okay. So, we learned a lot about the Fae last time, a lot, and that's kind of where we left off. He had this whole experience with Valuria. And now we are on chapter 100. And this chapter is called Shade? Shed? I don't know. S-H-A-E-D. I don't know how to pronounce that. I should perhaps explain a few peculiarities of the Fae. At first glance, Valurian's forest glade did not seem particularly odd. In most ways it resembled an ancient, untouched piece of forest. If not for the unfamiliar stars above, I might have suspected I was still in an isolated piece of the Eld. But there were differences. Since I had left my mercenary companions, I had slept perhaps a dozen times. Despite this, the sky above Valurian's pavilion remained the deep purpling blue of summer dusk, and showed no signs of changing. I had only the roughest guess as to how long I had been in the Fae. More importantly, I had no idea how much time might have been passing in the mortal world. Stories are full of boys who fall asleep in fairy circles only to wake as old men. Young girls wander into the woods and return years later, looking no older and claiming only minutes have passed. For all I knew, years could pass each time I slept in Valurian's arms. I could return to find a century had passed, or no time at all. Yeah, happy 100. I did my best not to think about it. Only a fool worries over what he can't control. The other difference in the Fae realm was much more subtle and difficult to describe. In the Medica, I had spent a fair amount of time around unconscious patients. I mention this to make a point. There is a great difference between being in a room that is empty and being in a room where someone is sleeping. A sleeping person is a presence in the room. They are aware of you, even if it is only a dim, vague awareness. This is what the Fae was like. It was such an odd, intangible thing that I didn't notice it for a long while. Then, once I became aware of it, it took me much longer to lay my finger on what the difference was. It felt as if I had moved from an empty room into a room where someone was asleep, except, of course, that there was no one there. It was as if everything around me was deeply asleep. The trees, the stones, the rippling stream that widened into Valurian's pool. All these things felt more solid, more present than I was used to, as if they were ever so slightly aware of me. The thought that I would eventually leave the Fae alive and unbroken was an unfamiliar one for the Valurian, and I could tell it troubled her. Often, while in the midst of an unrelated conversation, she would change direction and make me promise to return to her. I reassured her as best I could, but there are only so many ways you can say the same thing. After perhaps 3 dozen times, I said, "I will do my best to keep myself safe so I can come back to you." I saw her face change, becoming first anxious, then grim, then thoughtful. For a moment I worried she had decided to keep me as a pet mortal after all, and I began to berate myself for not fleeing the Fae when I had the chance. But before I could begin to grow genuinely concerned, Valurian cocked her head to one side and seemed to change the subject. "Would my sweet flame like a cloak?" I have one, I said, gesturing to where my possessions lay scattered at the edge of the pavilion. Only then did I notice that the tatty old tinker's cloak wasn't there. I saw my clothes, my boots, and my travel sack still bulging with the mare's lockbox, but my cloak and sword were gone. The fact that I hadn't noticed their absence was understandable, as I hadn't bothered dressing since I first woke next to Florian. She looked me over slowly, her expression intent, her eyes lingering on my knee, my lower arm, my upper arm. It was only when she took hold of my shoulder and turned me so she could examine my back that I realized she was looking at my scars. Florian took hold of my hand and traced a pale line that ran along my forearm. "You are not good at keeping yourself safe, my cloth." I was a little offended, especially as there was more than a little truth to what she said. "I do fairly well," I said stiffly, "considering the trouble that I find." Florian turned over my hand and examined my palm and fingers closely. "You are not a fighter," she mused softly to herself. "Yet you are all iron-bitten. You are a sweet bird that cannot fly. No bow, no knife, no chain." Her hand moved to my foot, running thoughtfully along the calluses and scars from my years on the streets of Tarbian. You are a long walker. You find me in the wild at night. You are a deep knower, and bold, and young, and trouble finds you." She looked up at me, her face intent. "Would my sweet poet like a shade?" "A what?" She paused as if considering her words. "A shadow." I smiled. "I already have one." Is this Peter Pan all of a sudden? Then I checked to make sure. I was in the Fae after all. Florian frowned, shaking her head at my lack of understanding. "Another I would give a shield, and it would keep him safe from harm. Another I would gift with amber, bind a scabbard tight with glamour, or craft a crown so men might look on you with love." She shook her head solemnly. "But not for you. You are a night walker, a moon follower. You must be safe from iron, from cold, from spite. You must be quiet. You must be light. You must move softly in the night. You must be quick and unafraid." She nodded to herself. "This means I must make you a shade." She stood and started walking toward the forest. "Come," she said. Florian had a way of making requests that took some getting used to. I'd discovered that unless I was steeling myself to resist, I'd find myself automatically doing whatever it was she asked of me. It wasn't that she spoke with authority. Her voice was too soft and edgeless to carry the weight of command. She did not demand or cajole. When she spoke, it was a matter of fact, as if she couldn't imagine a world in which you didn't want to do exactly as she said. Because of this, when Florian told me to follow her, I jumped like a puppet with its strings pulled. Soon I was padding along beside her, deep in the twilight shadows of the ancient forest, naked as a jaybird. I almost went back to grab my clothes, then decided to follow some advice my father had given me when I was young. "Everyone eats a different part of the pig," he said. "You want to fit in, you'll do the same. Different places, different decorums." So I followed, naked and unprepared. Florian struck out at a good pace, the moss muffling the sound of our bare feet. As we walked, there's a lot of stuff going on all of a sudden. One of my cats is on crack. The other one is wondering what he's doing. And there's a lot of noise coming from upstairs. Someone's moving furniture. Again. They move furniture like every night. I don't understand. Where was I? Okay, so the moss muffling the sound of our bare feet. As we walked, the forest grew darker. At first I thought it was simply the branches of the trees arching over our heads. Then I realized the truth. Above us, the twilight sky was slowly growing darker. Eventually, the last hint of purple was gone, leaving the sky a perfect velvet black, flecked with unfamiliar stars. Florian kept walking. I could see her pale skin in the starlight and the shapes of trees around us, but nothing more. Thinking myself clever, I made a sympathetic binding for light and held my hand above my head as if it were a torch. I was more than slightly proud of this, as the motion to light binding is rather difficult without a piece of metal to use as a focus. Light swelled, and I caught a moment's glimpse of our surroundings. Dark trunks of trees rose like massive pillars as far as the eye could see. There were no low-hanging branches, no undergrowth, no grass. Only dark moss underfoot and the arch of dark branches overhead. I was reminded of a vast, empty cathedral swathed in sooty velvet. "What are you doing?" "Siar Nalius," Florian snapped. Understanding her tone, if not her words, I broke the binding and let the darkness rush back over us. An instant later, Felurian leapt at me and bore me into the ground, her lithe, naked body pressed against mine. It was not an entirely uncommon occurrence, but this time the experience was not particularly erotic as the back of my head struck a knuckle of protruding root. Because of this I was half dazed and 9/10 blind when the earth shuddered slightly beneath us. Something vast and almost perfectly silent stirred the air above us and slightly off to one side of where we lay. Poised atop me, one leg on either side, Felurian's body was as taut as a harp string. The muscles of her thighs were tense and quivering. Her long hair fell over us, covering us like a silk sheet. Her breasts pressed against my chest as she drew a shallow, silent breath. Her body thrummed with the rhythm of her racing heart, and I felt her mouth move where it rested near the hollow of my throat. Softer than a whisper, Felurian spoke a gentle, edgeless word. I felt it press against my skin, sending silent ripples through the air the same way a thrown stone makes circles on the surface of a pond. There was a soft sound of movement above us, as if someone was folding a huge piece of velvet around a piece of broken glass. Saying that, I realize it makes no sense, but still, that is the best way I can describe the sound. It was a soft noise, the half-heard sound of deliberate movement. I cannot tell you why it made me think of something terrible and sharp, but it did. My forehead prickled with sweat, and I was filled with a sudden pure and breathless terror. Felurian went perfectly still, as if she were a startled deer or a cat about to pounce. Quietly, she drew a breath, then spoke a second word. Her breath brushed hot against my throat, and at the half-hearted word my body thrummed as if I were a drumhead soundly struck. Felurian turned her head in a bare degree, as if straining to listen. This movement pulled 1,000 strands of her splayed hair slowly over the entire left half of my naked body, covering me in goose-flesh. Even in the grip of my nameless terror, I shivered and gave a soft, involuntary gasp. There was a stirring in the air directly above us. The sharp nails of Felurian's left hand dug hard into the muscle of my shoulder. She shifted her hips and slowly slid her naked body up along my own until her face was even with mine. Her tongue flicked against my lips, and without even thinking, I tilted my head, reaching for the kiss. Her mouth met mine, and she drew a long, slow breath, pulling the air out of me. I felt my head grow light. Then, her lips still tight against mine, Felurian pushed her breath hard into me, filling my lungs. It was softer than silent. It tasted of honeysuckle. The ground shivered beneath me, and everything was still. For an endless moment, my heart ceased beating in my chest. A subtle tension left the air above us. Felurian pulled her mouth from mine, and my heart thumped again, sudden and hard. A second beat. A third. I pulled in a deep, shaking breath. Only then did Felurian relax. She lay atop me, loose and supple, her naked body flowing over mine like water. Her head nestled into the curve of my neck, and she gave me a sweet, contented sigh. A languid moment passed. Then she laughed, her body shaking with it. It was wild and delighted, as if she had just played the most marvelous joke. She sat up and kissed my mouth fiercely, then nipped at my ear before climbing off me and pulling me to my feet. I opened my mouth, then closed it, deciding this was probably not the right time for questions. Half of seeming clever is keeping your mouth shut at the right times. So we continued in darkness. Eventually my eyes adjusted, and through the branches above I could see the stars, differently patterned and brighter than those in the mortal sky. Their light was barely enough to give an impression of the ground and surrounding trees. Felurian's slender form was a silver shadow in the darkness. We kept walking, and the trees grew taller and thicker, blocking out the pale starlight bit by bit. Then it became truly dark. Felurian was little more than a piece of pale darkness ahead of me. She stopped walking before I lost sight of her entirely and cupped her hands around her mouth as if she were about to shout. I cringed at the thought of a loud noise invading the warm quiet of this place. But instead of a shout, there was nothing. No, not nothing. It was like a low, slow purr. Not anything so loud and rough as a cat's purr. It was closer to the sound a heavy snowfall makes, a muffled hush that almost makes less noise than no noise at all. Felurian did this several times. Then she took me by the hand and led me farther into the dark, where she repeated the odd, almost inaudible noise. After she had done this 3 times, it was so dark I could no longer see even the faintest shape of her. After the final pause, Felurian stepped close to me in the dark, pressing her body to mine. She gave me a long and thorough kiss that I expected to become something more involved when she pulled away and spoke softly into my ear. "Quietly," she breathed. "They come." For several minutes I strained my eyes and ears to no avail. Then I saw something luminous in the distance. It disappeared quickly, and I thought my light-starved eyes were playing tricks on me. Then I saw another flicker. 2 more. 10. 100 pale lights danced toward us through the trees, faint as foxfire. I'd heard of fool's fire before, but never seen it, and given that we were in the Fae, I doubted this was anything so mundane. I thought of 100 fairy stories and wondered which of those creatures could be responsible for these dim, madly dancing lights. Tom Sparks? Will-o'-wisps? Dennerlings with lanterns full of corpse light? Then they were all around us, startling me. The lights were smaller than I'd thought, and closer. I heard the hushed snowfall sound again, this time from all around me. I still couldn't guess what they might be until one of them brushed my arm as lightly as a feather. They were moths of some sort, moths with luminescent patches on their wings. They shone with a pale silvery light too weak to illuminate anything around them, but hundreds of them, dancing between the boles of trees, showed the silhouette of our surroundings. Some of them lit on trees or the ground. A few landed on Felurian, and though I still could not see more than a few inches of her pale skin, I could use the moving light of them to follow her. We walked a long while after that, Felurian leading between the trunks of ancient trees. Once I felt grass soft beneath my bare feet, instead of moss. Then there was soft soil, as if we were crossing a farmer's fresh-tilled field. For a time we followed a twisting path of smooth paved stone that led us over the arch of a high bridge. All the while the moths followed us, leaving me only the dimmest impression of our surroundings. Eventually Felurian stopped. By now the darkness was so thick I could almost feel it like a warm blanket around me. I could tell by the sound of the wind in the trees and the motion of the moths that we were standing in an open space. There were no stars above us. If we were in a clearing, the trees must be vast for their branches to meet overhead. But for all I knew, we could just as easily be deep underground, or perhaps the sky was black and empty in this portion of the Fae. It was a strangely unsettling thought. The subtle feeling of sleeping alertness was stronger here. If the rest of the Fae felt like it was sleeping, this place felt like it had stirred half a moment ago and hovered on the verge of waking. It was disconcerting. Felurian gently pressed the flat of her hand against my chest, then a finger against my lips. I watched as she moved away from me, softly humming a little snatch of the song I had made for her. But even this piece of flattery couldn't distract me from the fact that I was in the center of the Fae realm, blind, stark naked, and without the slightest idea of what was going on. A handful of moths had landed on Felurian, resting on her wrist, hip, shoulder, and thigh. Watching them gave me a vague impression of her movements. If I had to guess, I would have said she was picking things out of the trees, from behind or beneath bushes or stones. A warm breeze sighed through the clearing, and I felt strangely comforted as it brushed my bare skin. After about 10 minutes, Felurian came back and kissed me. She held something soft and warm in her arms. We walked back the way we had come. The moths gradually lost interest in us, leaving us with less and less of an impression of our surroundings. After what seemed like an interminable amount of time, I saw light filtering through a break in the trees ahead. It was only faint starlight, but at that moment it seemed bright as a curtain of burning diamonds. I started to walk through it, but Felurian took hold of my arm to stop me. Without a word, she sat me down where the first faint beams of starlight lanced through the trees to touch the ground. Carefully, she stepped between the rays of starlight, avoiding them as if they might burn her. When she stood in the center of them, she lowered herself to the ground and sat cross-legged, facing me. She held whatever she had collected in her lap, but other than the fact that it was shapeless and dark, I could tell nothing about it. Then Felurian reached out a hand, took hold of one of the thin beams of starlight, and pulled it toward the dark shape in her lap. I might have been more surprised if Felurian's manner hadn't been so casual. In the dim light, I saw her hands make a familiar motion. A second later, she reached out again, almost absent-mindedly, and grasped another narrow strand of starlight between her thumb and forefinger. She drew it in as easily as the first, and manipulated it in the same way. Again, the motion struck me as familiar, but it was nothing I could press my finger to. Felurian started to hum quietly to herself as she gathered in the next beam of starlight, brightening things an imperceptible amount. The shape in her lap looked like a thick, dark cloth. Seeing this, I realized what she reminded me of. My father sewing. Was she sewing by starlight? Sewing with starlight. Realization came to me in a flood. Shade meant shadow. She said that. She had somehow brought back an armful of shadow, and was sewing it with starlight, sewing me a cloak of shadow. Sound absurd? Absurd? It did to me. But regardless of my ignorant opinion, Felurian took hold of another strand of starlight and brought it to her lap. I brushed any doubt aside. Only a fool disbelieves what he sees with his own eyes. Besides, the stars above me were bright and strange. I was sitting next to a creature out of a storybook. What are you doing? I don't know if you could hear that or not, but my cat is... Sounds like he's knocking over his food dish for some reason. I was sitting next to a creature out of a storybook. She had been young and beautiful for 1,000 years. She could stop my heart with a kiss and talk to butterflies. Was I going to start quibbling now? After a while, I moved closer so I could watch more carefully. She smiled as I sat next to her, favoring me with a hasty kiss. I asked a couple questions, but her answers either made no sense or were hopelessly nonchalant. She didn't know the first thing about the laws of sympathy, or sygaldry, or the alar. She simply didn't think there was anything odd about sitting in the forest holding a handful of shadow. First I was offended, then I was terribly jealous. I remembered when I'd found the name of the wind in her pavilion. It had felt as if I were truly awake for the first time, true knowledge running like ice in my blood. The memory exhilarated me for a moment, then left me with a broken chord of loss. My sleeping mind was slumbering again. I turned my attention back to Felurian and tried to understand. Before too long, Felurian stood in a fluid motion and helped me to my feet. She hummed happily and took my arm as we strolled back the way we had come, chatting of little things. She held the dark shape of the shade draped easily over her arm. Then, just as the first faint hint of twilight began to touch the sky, she sung it invisibly in the dark branches of a nearby tree. Hung it invisibly, not sung it. There's an S nearby that I was looking at. Sometimes slow seduction is the only way, she said. The gentle shadow fears the candle flame. How could your fledgling shade not feel the same? Oh, Pam is here. Hi, Pam. Long time no see. Just reading a book. Just finished a chapter. I'm gonna take a sip of water. I think he's sexist is what it is. Is like, how many times does that happen to like a woman? She gives information, and then 5 seconds later, the man will be like, oh hey, it's like this. Even though the woman just said that. Because men don't listen. I say to the 2 men who are watching this. That's right. Sexism is bad, and men suck. And I have a cat in my face. You just gonna stand there? He's just standing on my lap. He's like, I'm just gonna chill right here. Okay. Now he's rubbing his face against the book. Louis already claimed that book. This whole time. Did you just not hear the entire story? Because I was reading it. Okay, what you doing? You gonna settle down? Or what are you doing? Oh. This is a nice change of pace. Okay. Chapter 101. Close enough to touch. After our shadow-gathering expedition, I asked more pointed questions about Felurian's magic. Most of her answers continued to be hopelessly matter-of-fact. How do you take hold of a shadow? She motioned with one hand, as if reaching for a piece of fruit. That was how, apparently. Other answers were nearly incomprehensible, filled with fey words I didn't understand. When she tried to describe those terms, our conversations became hopeless rhetorical tangles. At times I felt like I'd found myself a quieter, more attractive version of Illidan. I mean, it's spelled weird. I might be pronouncing it wrong, but it's probably something similar to that, yeah. Yeah, he wasn't really using common sense there, but, I mean, he's very distracted. He's got a lot on his mind with this, fey creature. Right, Louis? You're not Louis, you're Bagheera. I'm tired. Okay. Still, I learned a few scraps. Oh, big yawn. What she was doing with the shadow was called gramarye. When I asked, she said it was the art of making things be. This was distinct from from glamory. Okay, gramarye and glamory, which was the art of making things seem. I also learned that there aren't directions of the usual sort in the Fae. Your trifoil compass is useless as a tin codpiece there. North does not exist, and when the sky is endless twilight, you cannot watch the sun rise in the east. But if you look closely at the sky, one piece of the horizon will be a shade brighter, in the opposite direction a shade darker. If you walk toward the brighter horizon, eventually it will become daytime. The other way leads to darker night. Well, that's cool. If you keep walking in one direction long enough, you will eventually see a whole day pass and end up in the same place you began. That's the theory, at any rate. Felurian described those 2 points of the Fey compass as day and night. The other 2 points she referred to at different times as dark and light, summer and winter, or forward and backward. Once she even referred to them as grimward and grinning, but something about the way she said it made me suspect it was a joke. I have a good memory. That, perhaps more than anything else, sits in the center of what I am. It is the talent upon which so many of my other skills depend. I can only guess how I came by my memory. My early stage training, perhaps. The games my parents used to help me remember my lines. Perhaps it was the mental exercises Abenthi taught me to prepare me for the university. Wherever it came from, my memory has always served me well. Sometimes it works much better than I'd like. That said, my memory is strangely patchy when I think of my time in the Fae. My conversations with Felurian are clear as glass. Her lessons may as well be written on my skin. The sight of her, the taste of her mouth, they are all fresh as yesterday. But other things I cannot bring to my mind at all. For example, I remember Felurian in the purpling twilight. It dappled her through the trees, making her look as if she were under water. I remember her in flickering candlelight, the teasing shadows of it concealing more than it revealed. And I remember her in the full, rich amber of lamplight. She basked in it like a cat, her skin warm and glowing. But I do not remember lamps or candles. There is a great deal of fuss when dealing with such things, but I cannot remember a single moment spent trimming a wick or wiping soot from the glass hood of a lamp. I do not remember the smell of oil or smoke or wax. I remember eating fruit and bread and honey. Felurian ate flowers, fresh orchid. Oh my God, I can't read. Fresh orchids, wild trillium, lush salus. I had tried some myself. The violets were my favorite. I don't mean to imply she ate only flowers. She enjoyed bread and butter and honey. She liked blackberries especially, and there was meat too, not with every meal, but sometimes. Wild venison, pheasant, bear. Felurian ate hers so rare that it was almost raw. She was not a fastidious eater either, not prim or courtly. We ate with our hands and teeth, and afterwards, if we were sticky with honey or pulp or the blood of bears, we would wash ourselves in the nearby pool. I can see her even now, naked, laughing, blood running down her chin. She was regal as a queen, eager as a child, proud as a cat. He uses a lot of cat metaphors. And she was like none of those things. Nothing like them, not in the least little bit. My point is this. I can remember our eating. What I cannot remember is where the food came from. Did someone bring it? Did she gather it herself? I cannot bring it to mind to save my life. The thought of servants intruding on the privacy of her twilight glade seems impossible to me, but so is the thought of Felurian baking her own bread. The deer, on the other hand, I could understand. I had not the least doubt she could run one to the ground and kill it with her hands if she desired, or I could picture a shy hart venturing into the quiet of her twilight glade. I can imagine Felurian sitting, patient and calm, waiting until it came close enough to touch. Name of the chapter. And that's the end of that chapter. Everything is like a cat in this book. Right? Right, but you're off camera. Oh, baby. He gives me the sweetest, he looks up at me with his big eyes, with so much love. He's such a sweetheart. You're a sweet boy. Good boy. He's so loving. Okay. Chapter 102. The Ever-Loving Moon. There's a lot of chapters on the Felurian. Felurian and I were walking down to the pool when I noticed a subtle difference in the quality of light. Looking up, I was surprised to see... Oh, here goes the fan on my computer again. Hang on, let me fix that. It's weird, but I got into the habit of using my laptop to hold up my phone. And there are other things I could probably use, but this just works so well because it's the shape of it. It supports the bottom and the back of the phone and holds it up. I'm just gonna muffle that sound. Okay. I should just do that outright from the beginning every time, so I don't have to pause and do it. Yeah, I know. It's just we're spending a lot of time on this. Okay. So even though it was only the slenderest crescent, I recognized it as the same moon I had known my whole life. Seeing it in this strange place was like meeting a long-lost friend far from home. "Look," I said, pointing. "The moon!" Florian smiled indulgently. "You are my precious newborn lamb. Look, there hangs a cloud as well. A moon. Dance for joy." She laughed. I flushed, embarrassed. "It's just that I haven't seen it in—" I trailed off, having no way to gauge my time. "A long while. Besides, you have different stars. I thought perhaps you had a different moon as well." Florian ran her fingers gently through my hair. "Foolish sweet, there is only one moon. We have been waiting on her. She will help us in biten your shade." She slipped into the water, sleek as an otter. When she surfaced, her hair slicked her shoulders like ink. I sat on a stone by the edge of a pool and dangled my feet. The water was warm as a bath. "How can the moon be here," I asked, "if this is a different sky?" "There is only one slender slip of her here," Florian said. "She is still mostly in the mortal now." "But how?" I asked. Florian stopped swimming and floated on her back, looking up at the sky. "Oh, moon," she said forlornly, "I perish for kisses. Why have you brought me an owl when I desired a man?" She sighed, then softly hooted into the light. How? Hey! Sorry.
What? What? What are you meowing at? You're such a tiny little meow. You're like a little kitten. Yeah.
I don't know if you can hear that. He's making little cute noises. Okay. I slid into the water, not as lithe as an otter, perhaps, but somewhat better at kissing. A while later, we lay in the shallows on a broad sheet of stone, worn water smooth. "Thank you, moon," Florian said, looking up at the sky contentedly, "for this sweet and lusty manling." There were luminous fishes in the pool, no larger than your hand, each with a stripe or spot of gently growing color. I watched them emerge from whatever hiding places they had scattered to, startled by the recent turbulence. They were orange as glowing coals. Ugh. Stop it. As glowing coals. Yellow as buttercups and blue as noontime sky. Florian slid back into the water, then tugged at my leg. "Come, my kissing owl," she said, "and I will show you to the workings of the moon." I followed her into the pool until we stood shoulder deep. The fish came to explore, the braver ones coming close enough to swim between us. Their motion revealed the hidden silhouette of Florian's body beneath the water. Despite the fact that I had explored her nakedness in great detail, I suddenly found myself fascinated by the suggested shape of her. Oh my goodness! Bagheera, why? Sorry. I guess I disturbed him with my yelling. I don't know if he, didn't know what I was yelling about, and he was, worried that he was in trouble. Because I wasn't yelling at him, I was yelling at Louis, who was, messing with boxes that I still had not unpacked. Anyways. The fish came closer still. One brushed me, and I felt a gentle nip against my ribs. I jumped, though its tiny bite was soft as a tapping finger. I watched as more of the fish circled around, occasionally nibbling at us. "Even the fish delight in kissing you," Florian said, stepping closer to press her wet body against mine. "I think they must like the salt on my skin," I said, looking down at them. No, that was an accident. He was just walking, and he thought that my laptop keyboard was a good place to walk. And when he did that, he catapulted the phone from its position. It was like a seesaw. He pressed the bottom of the laptop, and the phone just fell. Or he did it on purpose, and he was being an asshole. Who knows? Okay, she pushed me away, irritated. "Mayhap they like the taste of owl." Before I could make an appropriate reply, she assumed a serious expression, flattened her hand, and lowered it into the water between us. "There is only one moon," Florian said. "She moves between your mortal sky and mine." She pressed her palm against my chest, then brought it back and pressed it to her own. "She sways between, back and forth." She stopped, frowning at me. "Be mindful of my words." "I am." I lied. No, you are mindful of my breasts. It was true. They flirted with the surface of the water. They are well worth minding, I said. To not attend to them would be a terrible insult. I speak of important things, knowings you must have if you are to return safe to me. She gave an exasperated sigh. If I let you touch one, will you attend to my words? Yes. She took hold of my hand and pulled it close to cup her breast. Make waves upon lilies. You haven't shown me waves upon lilies yet. That will come later, then. She put her flat hand back in the water between us, then sighed softly, her eyes going halfway closed. Ah, she said. Oh. Eventually the fish emerged from their hiding places again. My most distractible owl, Valerian said, not unkindly. She dove to the bottom of the pool and returned holding a smooth, round stone. Attend you now to what I say. You are the mortal, I the fae. Here is the moon, she said, tucking the stone between our palms and lacing our fingers together to hold it. She's tethered tight to both the fae and the mortal night. Valerian stepped forward and pressed the stone against my chest. Thus moves the moon, she said, tightening her fingers around mine. Now, when I look above, there is no glimmer of the light I love. Instead, all like a flower unfurled, her face shines on your mortal world. She stepped back so our arms were straight with our clasped hands between us. Then she pulled the stone toward her chest, dragging me through the water by my hand. Now all your mortal maidens sigh, for she is fully in my sky. I nodded, understanding. Beloved by both the fae and men, our moon's a merry wanderer then. Oh, I kind of did the wrong voice there. Not that I'm doing super different voices, but that was Quoth. Beloved by both the fae and men, our moon's a merry wanderer then. Valerian shook her head. Not so. A traveler, yes. A wanderer, no. She moves but cannot freely go. I heard a story once, I said, about a man who stole the moon. Valerian's expression went solemn. Now he's gonna... She unlaced her fingers from mine and looked down at the stone in her hand. That was the end of it all, she sighed. Until he stole the moon, there was some hope for peace. I was stunned by the matter-of-fact tone in her voice. What? I asked dumbly. The stealing of the moon. She cocked her head at me, puzzled. You said you knew of it. I said I'd heard a story, I said, but it was a silly thing, not a story of what truly was. It was the sort of story that you tell a child. She smiled again. You may call them fairy stories. I know of them. They are fancies. We tell our children manling tales betimes. So the fairies tell human tales. Good to know. But the moon was truly stolen? I asked. That was no fancy? Valerian scowled. This I have been showing you, she said, bringing her hand down in an angry splash. I found myself making the Adem gesture for apology below the surface of the water, before realizing it was doubly pointless. I'm sorry, I said, but without the truth of this story I'm lost. I beg of you to tell me it. It is an old story, and a sad one. She gave me a long look. What then will you trade me? The hushed heart, I said. And this is H-A-R-T. I don't know what that is. It's not this kind of heart. In that you give a gift that is a gift to you, she said archly. What else? I will also make 1,000 hands, I said, watching her expression soften. And I will show you something new I have thought of all myself. I call it swaying against the wind. Grocery shopping and doing laundry. She crossed her arms and looked away, making a great show of indifference. New perhaps to you, I doubtless know it by a different name. Perhaps, I said, but if you will not trade, you cannot know. Very well, she conceded with a sigh, but only because you are quite good at 1,000 hands. Valerian looked up at the slender moon for a moment, then said, Long before the cities of man, before men, before fae, there were those who walked with their eyes open. They knew all the deep names of things. She paused and looked at me. Do you know what this means? When you know the name of a thing, you have a mastery over it, I said. No, she said, startling me with the weight of rebuke in her voice. Mastery was not given. They had the deep knowing of things, not mastery. To swim is not mastery over the water. To eat an apple is not mastery of the apple. She gave me a sharp look. Do you understand? I didn't, but I nodded anyway, not wanting to upset her or sidetrack the story. These old name-knowers moved smoothly through the world. They knew the fox, and they knew the hare, and they knew the space between the two. She drew a deep breath and let it out in a sigh. Then came those who saw a thing and thought of changing it. They thought in terms of mastery. They were shapers, proud dreamers. She made a conciliatory gesture. And it was not all bad at first. There were wonders. Her face lit with the memory, and her fingers gripped my arm excitedly. Once, sitting on the walls of Morella, I ate fruit from a silver tree. It shone, and in the dark you could mark the mouth and eyes of all those who had tasted it. Was Morella in the Fae? Felurian frowned. No, I have said. This was before. There was but one sky, one moon, one world, and it was in Morella, and the fruit, and myself eating it, eyes shining in the dark. How long ago was this? She gave a small shrug. Long ago. Long ago. Longer than any book of history I had ever seen or even heard of. The archives had copies of Caliptenian histories that went back 2 millennia, and none of them held the barest whisper of the things Felurian spoke of. Forgive my interruption, I said as politely as possible, and made as much of a bow to her as I could without going entirely under water. Mollified, she continued. The fruit was but the first of it, the early toddlings of a child. They grew bolder, braver, wild. The old knowers said stop, but the shapers refused. They quarreled and fought and forbade the shapers. They argued against mastery of this sort. Her eyes brightened. But oh, she sighed, the things they made. This from a woman weaving me a cloak out of shadow. I couldn't guess what she might marvel at. What did they make? She gestured widely around us. Trees? I asked, awestruck. She laughed at my tone. No, the Faen realm. She waved widely. Wrought according to their will, the greatest of them sewed it from whole cloth, a place where they could do as they desired. At the end of all their work, each shaper wrought a star to fill their new and empty sky. Felurian smiled at me. Then there were 2 worlds, 2 skies, 2 sets of stars. She held up the smooth stone, but still 1 moon, and it all round and cozy in the mortal sky. Her smile faded. But one shaper was greater than the rest. For him, the making of a star was not enough. He stretched his will across the world and pulled her from her home. Lifting the smooth stone to the sky, Felurian carefully closed one eye. She tilted her head as if trying to fit the curve of the stone into the empty arms of the crescent moon above us. That was the breaking point. The old knowers realized no talk would ever stop the shapers. Her hand dropped back into the water. He stole the moon, and with it came the war. Who was it? I asked. Her mouth curved into a tiny smile. She hooted. Who? Who? Was he of the Faen courts? I prompted gently. Felurian shook her head, amused. No, as I said, this was before the Fae, the first and greatest of the shapers. What was his name? She shook her head. No calling of names here. I will not speak of that one, though he was shut beyond the doors of stone. Before I could ask more questions, Felurian took my hand and nestled the stone between our palms again. This shaper of the dark and changing eye stretched out his hand against the pure black sky. He pulled the moon, but could not make her stay, so now she moves twixt mortal and the Fae. She gave me a solemn look, so rare a thing on her fair face. You have your tale, your who and how. There is a final secret now, so all your owlish listening lend. She brought our joined hands back to the surface of the water. This is the part on which you must attend. Felurian's eyes were black in the dim light. The moon has our 2 worlds beguiled, like parents clutching at a child, pulling at her to and fro, neither willing to let go. She stepped away, and we stood as far apart as we could, the stone gripped in our hands. When she is torn half in your sky, you see how far apart we lie. Felurian reached toward me with her free hand, making futile, grasping gestures in the empty water. No matter how we long to kiss, the space between us is not ripe for this. Felurian stepped forward and pressed the stone close to my chest. And when your moon is waxing full, all of Fairy feels the pull. She draws us close to you, so bright, and now a visit for a night is easier than walking through a door or stepping off a ship that's near the shore. She smiled at me. 'Twas thus while wandering in the wild, you found Felurian, manling child. The thought of an entire world of fey creatures drawn close by the swelling moon was troubling. And this is true of any fey? She shrugged and nodded. Have they the will and know the way? There are 1,000 half-cracked doors that lead between my world and yours. How have I never heard of this? It seems it would be hard to miss. Fey dancing on the mortal grass. She laughed. But has not just this come to pass? The world is wide and time is long, but still you say you heard my song before you saw me singing there, brushing moonlight through my hair. I frowned. Still, it seems I should have seen more signs of those who walk between. They're just... This is like the best banter ever. They're just rhyming to each other. Florian shrugged. Most fey are sly and subtle folk who step as softly as chimney smoke. Some go among your kind and shaden, glamoured as a pack of mule-laden, or wearing gowns to fit a queen. She gave me a frank look. We know enough to not be seen. She took my hand again. Many of the darker sort would love to use you for their sport. What seems these for moonlit trespass? Iron, fire, mirror glass. Elm and ash and copper knives, solid-hearted farmers' wives who know the rules of games we play and give us bread to keep away. But worst of all, my people dread the portion of our power we shed when we set foot on mortal earth. We are more trouble than we're worth, I admitted, smiling. Florian reached out and touched a finger to my mouth. While she is full, you may still laugh, but know there is a darker half. She spun away to arm's length, pulling me through the water in a slow spiral. A clever mortal fears the night without a hint of sweet moonlight. She began to draw my hand to her chest, dragging me through the water toward her as she spun. On such a night, each step you take might catch you in the dark moon's wake, and pull you all unwitting into fey. She stopped and gave me a grim look, where you will have no choice but stay. Florian took a step backward in the water, tugging at me. And on such unfamiliar ground, how can a mortal help but drown? I took another step toward her and found nothing beneath my feet. Florian's hand was suddenly no longer clasping mine, and black water closed over my head. Blind and choking, I began to thrash desperately, trying to find my way back to the surface. After a long, terrifying moment, Florian's hands caught me and dragged me into the air as if I weighed no more than a kitten. Again with the cat metaphors. Well, not metaphors, but... She brought me close to her face, her dark eyes hard and glittering. When she spoke, her voice was clear. I do this so you cannot help but hear. A wise man views a moonless night with fear. That was almost the title of a book. Alright, well, that was a very interesting chapter. And fun to read. Okay, that was me that time. Sorry, I forgot that I can't put weight there. I'm just kind of checking out the next chapter. Oh, okay. Yeah, we can definitely do the next one, if not the next one after that. That's okay. Okay, chapter 103. Lessons. Time passed. Florian took me dayward to a piece of forest even older and grander than the one that surrounded her twilight glade. There we climbed trees as tall and broad as mountains. In the highest branches you could feel the vast tree swaying in the wind like a ship on the swelling sea. There, with nothing but the blue sky around us and the slow motion of the tree beneath, Florian taught me ivy on the oak. I tried to teach Florian talk, only to discover she already knew it. She beat me handily, and played a game so lovely Braden would have wept to look on it. I learned a bit of the Fey tongue, a small bit, a scattering. Actually, in the interest of pure honesty, I will admit that I failed miserably in my attempt to learn the Fey language. Florian was a less than patient teacher, and the language bafflingly complex. My failure went beyond mere incompetence, to the point where Florian actually forbade me from attempting to speak it in her presence. That was pretty bad. Overall, I gained a few phrases and a great dollop of humility. Useful things. Florian taught me several Feyan songs. They were harder for me to remember than mortal songs, their melodies slippery and twisting. When I tried to play them on my lute, the strings felt strange beneath my fingers, making me fumble and stutter as if I were some country boy who'd never held a lute before. I learned their lyrics by rote, without the least inkling what the words might mean. Through it all, we continued to work on my shade. Rather, Florian worked on it. I asked questions, watched, and tried to avoid feeling like a curious child underfoot in the kitchen. As we grew more comfortable with each other, my questions became more insistent. But how? I asked for the 10th time. Light hasn't any weight, any substance. It behaves like a wave. You shouldn't be able to touch it. Florian had worked her way up from the starlight. Oh my god, I'm sorry. Florian had worked her way up from starlight and was wafting moonlight into the shade. She didn't look up from her work when she replied, "So many thoughts, my Quoth. You know too much to be happy." That sounded uncomfortably like something Elodin would say. I brushed the evasion aside. Is Elodin a fae? Are we going to find that out? You shouldn't be able... She nudged me with her elbow, and I saw both her hands were full. Sweet flame, she said. Bring that to me. She nodded to a moonbeam that pierced the trees above and touched the ground beside me. Her voice bore the familiar, subtle tone of command, and without thinking, I grabbed the moonbeam as if it were a hanging vine. For a second I felt it against my fingers, cool and ephemeral. Startled, I froze, and suddenly it was an ordinary moonbeam again. I passed my hand through it several times, to no effect. Smiling, Felurian reached out and took hold of it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She touched my cheek with her free hand, then turned her attention to her lap and worked the strand of moonlight into the folds of shadow. It just seems like he's having the longest acid trip ever, or the a regular-sized one, and he just feels like it's a week or two long. Oh my god. Okay. This next one's pretty long. I think I'll stop here. Yeah, Florian does. Yeah, I mean, it is similar to Ari. Pets and their owners are so alike. Wait, what was that? I don't know what that was referring to. But, yeah, she is a bit different because it's more... Ari's, like, I feel like more random, and she has, like, her own little thoughts going on in her head that aren't really part of reality, but the Fae seems to be, like, more confident about, like... Or, not confident, but, like... She seems to kind of know more about what she's talking about, and it's, like, an actual... This feels more like a real reality that she's very in tune with and very knowledgeable about, as opposed to Ari's just kind of in her own little world and not really connected to reality of any kind. Oh yeah, when we both talked down the phone. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yep. But I felt dumb there. Okay, well, I'm gonna end it there, and yeah, I'm looking forward to all the other twists and turns this book is gonna take, because I just don't know what to think, or can't predict what's gonna happen in this thing. It's taking us to a lot of places, that's for sure. So I guess we will see what our schedules are all like for the next week, and pick a day soon to do the next one. Good night. I'll see you guys next time.